Hello, Foreign Entanglements viewers. I am Rob Farley from the Patterson School at the University of Kentucky, and with me today is Kevin Levin. Kevin, can you introduce yourself?
Yeah, hi, my name's Kevin. Actually, it's Levin.
Levin, sorry.
No problem, no problem. I teach American history at Gann Academy, which is a small private school outside of Boston, and be online at my blog, Civil War Memory.
Civil War Memory, which is fantastic, and you've been. So what we're going to talk about today, and we actually had talked previously about the Gettysburg commemoration a couple of years ago for long-time Foreign Entanglements viewers.
Right.
What we're going to talk about today is roughly the same topic, but associated with the commemoration of the two sort of really big events that happened in April of 1865 and that have now been commemorated now, which are the surrender at Appomattox Courthouse and the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. And then we're going to move into sort of broader considerations or some broader topics of how, we remember, not only the Civil War, but how we remember the penumbra of the Civil War, and in particular Reconstruction and what sort of this 150-year relook at Reconstruction may look like. And then we'll talk a bit more about the commemoration. So, but to start with, I mean, these past 2 weeks have been, surely they must be among the most exciting for someone who sort of has your interest and is in your field, right?
Yeah,
in terms of just sort of really specific thinking about the end of the Civil War.
Yeah, absolutely. And to be completely honest, it's been tough living up here in Boston. After having lived in Virginia for so long, for over 10 years, and right in the middle of the sesquicentennial, my wife and I jumped ship, if you will. So it would have been nice to be in Virginia this past week. I'm of two minds when it comes to the Appomattox commemoration. On the one hand, in contrast with the centennial, as far as I can tell, very little was done, so that the National Park Service went to such lengths to put on, a multi-day commemoration was actually quite impressive. And of course, they brought in a number of heavyweights, like Ed Ayers and David Blight, to sort of set the stage. On the other hand, and I should say that the Appomattox commemoration was much more about the broader war than just the surrender. So they went to great lengths to sort of talk about emancipation, the presence of Black soldiers. On the other hand, I think we still sort of see Appomattox as this very strictly defined ending point to the Civil War. And certainly Americans in April of 1865, would have been celebrating in the streets, hearing the news of Robert E. Lee's army. Of course, that was not the final Confederate army to surrender. But broader than that, obviously, the war, as some historians argue, continued. Greg Downs has a wonderful new book called After Appomattox, and he's very clear that the U.S. government maintained a war front or a war footing, at least for the next few years, in terms of the occupation of parts of the South. So our tendency to see Appomattox as first an endpoint in the Civil War, and then I would add a point of reunion. I think there's still that. That's from the centennial, clearly, this notion of that we should see the Civil War as a moment ultimately where Americans found common ground. And that's still very much a presence, in 2015.
Right. Yeah. The war continued not only in the sense that, it would lead to Reconstruction in this long-term guerrilla campaign, but there were literally still battles being fought for the next 2 months until, the last major formation is General Waite, a couple months into June, if I recollect. But yes, it is interesting, and you're obviously in a great position to comment on this, right? How, the acceptance of Lee's surrender is characterized, sort of where what, can appear to different people, sort of Grant's attitude towards Lee's surrender, which sort of on the one hand can be characterized almost purely in tactical terms, right? That all of the concessions that are made sort of at this moment that Grant is accepting the surrender, and of course we have all the great paintings and so forth, are sort of generated from Grant's point of view, or at least one interpretation, and maybe you could comment on this, is that what this is it's sort of a purely tactical preference on Grant, sort of with the understanding that it is very much necessary to achieve a formal surrender from Lee in order to prevent the continuation of the war, in order to prevent the diversion of Confederate forces to guerrilla fighting and the dispersal of Confederate armies, right? And so, Grant is thinking very tactically on this level, but sort of the things he's writing and the way that he is treating Lee is treated, perhaps in the Centennial and also to some extent this, as this, the opening the door to the great healing of the rift between our great peoples, right?
Yeah.
Which does not sort of really seem to me, but, again, perhaps you can comment on it, to be an appropriate way of thinking about how Grant was approaching this surrender.
Well, certainly Grant, was involved in a recent meeting with Lincoln and others, and was told to let them up easy, right? That he was going to give them fairly lenient, from Lincoln's point of view. He wanted to give the South every chance to rejoin the Union, and so to make the surrender terms as lenient as possible, which was certainly the case. At the same time, Lee, I believe, if you look at it from his perspective, believed that he had the opportunity, or that the surrender was perhaps part of a process of returning to the status quo, that it was a return back to the past, that this was a surrender of his army, certainly, but also that it would be a reconstituting of the Union as it was, as opposed to what we know happens as a result of Reconstruction. Grant, of course, if you read his memoir, is very clear about how he evaluates the cause for which Lee fought. It was the worst cause one could fight for. But in the end, I think you're right. Appomattox is still sort of seen from the top down as this moment of reunion, right? As this key moment of reunion. When you dig into the actual surrender ceremony and the days surrounding that ceremony, there's an incredible amount of animosity among especially Confederate soldiers who are, of course, still holding tightly to the cause for which they fought. That stands in sharp contrast to our memory of Appomattox.
Right. So, how would you characterize the difference between the 150 and the 100? I know you spoke a little bit about it, but I know you've also researched the 100, the Centennial. I mean,
a bit.
Yeah. So, I mean, the Centennial was larger, but the Centennial was also at a much different time in the United States, right? I mean, the Centennial is being in 1965, in which these issues have become raw again in the United States.
Part of the problem with the Centennial, it's funny because, a lot of people who lived through it, especially as kids, it's funny to listen to them remember the Centennial because, of course, they're always comparing it with the sesquicentennial, and for some reason, the 150th is always lacking in some way. But, and I say that because when you actually dig into the Centennial, it starts off with some promise. I mean, there's a national commission formed in the late 1950s, but there's controversy right from the beginning. One of the first meetings of the National Commission was held in South Carolina in 1961 in April, and it was to be held at the Francis Marion Hotel, which, of course, with Northern delegates, African-American delegates, they were not allowed to stay in the hotel. So Kennedy had to order that the meeting be held on a nearby Air Force base. So that, and then, of course, with the broader civil rights movement going on at the same time, created a kind of just a natural rub. It was inevitable because the Centennial, as it was planned, was still framed around, I guess you might say, a lost cause or reconciliationist narrative. In other words, Americans were not going to talk or address the tough questions about slavery and race. And so that in and of itself almost dooms it from the beginning. And what I found, there's a wonderful book by Robert Cook on the Centennial called Troubled Commemoration. And what he finds is that really by the middle of the Centennial, so you're talking roughly 1963, there really is very little going on. Appomattox, like I said a few moments ago, as far as I can tell, there isn't much of anything going on to mark the end of the war. And I think it's safe to say that by 1965, Americans simply have had enough. Or maybe it's more accurate to say that Americans, or at least event organizers, probably didn't have the willingness to sort of push forward with events that they knew would be challenged by a counter memory of slavery, United States colored troops, and a reminder of the unfinished business of the war itself. Appomattox, interestingly enough, I believe only becomes part of the National Park Service in the 1950s. So it's a fairly recent acquisition. For a long time, especially during the early 20th century, it actually was fairly difficult for veterans of the North and South to come together. It was simply too painful an event to remember and commemorate. And so it's more a recent addition to our, you might say, commemorative landscape of the Civil War.
So before, because I want to talk about Lincoln too, because that's the other big event. But before that, I mean, there was some call last week on the internet, on Twitter, other places, for sort of approaching the surrender of Appomattox and sort of creating a national Civil War holiday here, is celebrating, right? Essentially a celebratory holiday, which would in effect recognize that Appomattox commemorates more than simply the reunion of Americans, but it celebrates a great victory over a tremendous evil, right? And that with the sort of our commemoration of it should be very explicit in these terms, and it should become a national holiday, which seemed to appeal to me because I like holidays and I get a day off. But I mean, you were not as high on that idea as some of the other Twitterers.
I was not, and I got I got a lot of negative feedback for it, which is fine. I'm not so much against holidays. My concern was with the broader, I guess, with the undertone of the essay itself, which he never really came out and said it, in such explicit terms, but it was just underneath the surface, this idea that somehow Americans are not engaged in a discussion about Civil War memory, or that we are hopelessly bogged down as a nation in the lost cause, that our collective memory of the war has not evolved over the last, say, 50 years since the centennial. And I simply reject that argument. I'm not against the holiday per se. I'm against sort of what seemed to me was sort of coloring this proposal.
Right. No, whether the time frame, the characterization of how Americans think about the Civil War seems very junior high schoolish to me. And I mean that junior high schoolish sort of in terms of the narrative that was given to me in junior high school, but that I don't think is still sort of extant, at least not in large swaths of the country. So it felt a little bit dated, not even within a sort of 50-year time span, but even maybe within a quarter century time frame where sort of we have come, there's been some progress in sort of our level of interpretation of the events. And so, which is not to say, I still sort of, for me, sort of the recognition of the purpose behind the Civil War is also sort of very important. So, the idea still has a degree of appeal to me on those metrics, but I also sort of understand some of the objections. How would you, so the second great thing now is the commemoration of Lincoln, and there's been a lot of, so what I think is really fantastic unearthing of media reports stemming from just right after Lincoln's assassination. And so I'm sure you saw the AP report where they did not mention, the writer did not mention, it was a fantastic article and it was florid in its language and sort of deeply affected, and but did not mention that Lincoln had been assassinated until the third paragraph. And so every journalist was like, this is how things were done in 1865. And the Cincinnati Enquirer ran a short article saying that they had completely missed the assassination for several days. And I have a friend at the Enquirer who mentioned this, and so it was very interesting. But historically, has the end of the war and the Lincoln assassination been so tied together, or have they had sort of different meanings, right? Where does the deification of Lincoln does it run parallel or in contrast to narratives we have that develop over time about the Civil War and narratives about commemoration of the Civil War, right? I mean, obviously we have a Lincoln memorial, and we don't have sort of a Civil War memorial in the same way.
Yeah.
So, what's your view? What have been your thoughts with respect to how Lincoln has been commemorated in the past week, as opposed to sort of the broader commemoration of the Civil War?
Yeah, well, I think obviously he's been at the center of the sesquicentennial in a way he probably wasn't in the centennial, simply because for the 150th, clearly the dominant theme has been slavery, emancipation, and United States colored troops, the service of USCTs. So Lincoln, has been there, I think, right from the beginning, and has played a central role in sort of how we're now, constructing our memory of it.
Mm-hmm.
And it's interesting, of course, because as Obama was running for his first term, and maybe this stands in contrast somewhat with the broader 150th narrative. At the beginning of when he was running, of course, he made his announcement on the footsteps of the old legislative hall, I think, in Illinois, in Springfield, where Lincoln served. And Obama closely identified himself with Lincoln. In the last few years, he hasn't done so. He didn't show up for the Gettysburg 150th, for the anniversary of the Emancipation Proclamation. But I think more broadly, Lincoln has been there simply because Americans are much more comfortable sort of talking about, emancipation and the centrality of slavery overall. I guess the one, in terms of how Lincoln is framed, I think in public discourse, we still do see him, of course, as the great emancipator. As much as we've tried to, muddy up the waters a bit, place Lincoln back in the historical context, the political context, that's been difficult, I think. When I think about the war and Lincoln, I think Union first. Right. I think Union first, and I think emancipation, the end of slavery as a way to preserve the Union. That concept is a very difficult one, I think, for Americans in 2015 to grasp and appreciate, in the way in which Americans did in 1861, the beginning of the war, and then, of course, at the end. But of course, his death makes it very easy at the very end of the war to mythologize. There's some wonderful work being done, about his legacy and about his memory over time. But even in the wake of the war, Martha Hodes's new book, Mourning Lincoln, is absolutely wonderful in the way that she gets at just the range of responses to Lincoln's assassination, even in the North, and even within the Republican Party. She suggests that there were a number of people who were not shedding tears over his assassination. So certainly Lincoln, his place in the sesquicentennial, I think, is it's a central place. But I sometimes worry about whether or not the race and the slavery narrative overshadows what Americans at the time would have pointed to as the primary reason for the war and its and why it was important to win it by 1864.
For reasons that are also sort of for reasons that are sort of broadly cultural and are political, but that also have some foundations in the profession of historian, the modern profession of historian. We seem to cycle through a Lincoln Reformation, counter-Reformation every 20 years or so.
Yeah, I think that's true. Let me just add one point, because I think it's important. Probably for me, one of the big surprises over the course of the sesquicentennial is the extent to which Lincoln, I don't want to, maybe it's I go too far to say embraced by Southerners, but certainly in the South, if you look at the kinds of events that have taken place, there seems to be a sort of a more open, more welcoming attitude in the South than perhaps you would have expected to find, or certainly was the case a couple decades ago. And I assume that has something to do with the broad demographic shifts, political shifts that have taken place in the last few decades.
Right. No, it's fascinating. So here in Lexington, where to what I think is the city's enduring discredit, we still have a statue of John C. Breckinridge right on Main Street.
Right.
In fact, they moved the statue a few years ago from just off of Main Street to right on Main Street.
Mm-hmm.
So you cannot drive down Main Street of Lexington, Kentucky without seeing John C. Breckinridge.
Which most people probably can't identify anyway.
Which most people can't identify, but no one likes, right? But the sort of enduring, very old families in town and so forth put it there and still want it there.
Yeah.
But not far away from that, and much more recent, there is this fabulous painting against a sort of very large wall that's very easy to see of Lincoln, right? Of Lincoln of Lincoln Memorial Lincoln, but it's all multicolored and it's sort of very vibrant and it sort of is much loved by people here in a way that the Breckinridge statue is ignored and so forth. And so it's very interesting that you now have both of these going on. But it's also interesting that it's specifically an embrace of Lincoln as opposed to sort of a broader thinking about the Union versus the Confederacy.
That's right, and I think that points to a broader shift in sort of Southern memory of the war. Mm-hmm. I've written about this I don't know how many times, but it seems to me that Confederate heritage, in the form of Confederate flags, in the form of the maintenance of Confederate statues. It seems to me that is in full retreat in the South. I mean, over the last few years, it is one town community after another that is making the decision to remove flags from public places, or to stop maintaining monuments, or to, in the case of Charlottesville, Virginia, my old hometown, recently got rid of Lee Jackson Day in Lexington, where both Jackson and Lee are buried. Obviously, Washington and Lee College, where Lee served as president in the period after the war, before he died. They just made the decision to remove Confederate flags from the recumbent statue to Lee in the Lee Chapel on campus. It caused an uproar, but that's happening across the South. So there is something quite dramatic taking place. It's generational. Right. Again, it has to do with a lot of the shifts in population, cultural shifts, but it really is quite remarkable what's happening. And I think you're probably seeing that especially in parts of the Upper South, like Lexington.
Right. I mean, I visited Montgomery a few months ago, and an interesting conversation there, sort of that talked about, once sort of African Americans were integrated into the political system and actually achieved a degree of representation in Alabama, the strategy taken was not so much to remove the old monuments; it was simply to make sure that money was allocated for new monuments and new remembrances.
That's right.
And what will be interesting is sort of how that turns out to be a sort of positive strategy moving forward as people I mean, for example, I was both stunned and not stunned to learn that both of Montgomery's public high schools, one was named Jefferson Davis and the other was named Robert E. Lee, right? And both, of course, have 95% African American enrollment. Right. And so how long that sort of thing endures, based on what we have as based on this generational shift, will be really interesting. Yeah. Right.
Richmond, Virginia, is a great example of a city that obviously it is. It's defined by its monuments to the Confederacy, right? Just think of Monument Avenue, Hollywood Cemetery. But over the last at least 2 decades, a number of new monuments have been placed, dedicated in the city and beyond. And their approach has been to not remove old monuments, but to add to the landscape, which I think is the better way to go. I mean, as an educator. Especially when I lived in Virginia, every year I would take a field trip to talk about memory and the war with my students. And, it seems to me that the argument to remove the monuments outright is an expression of wanting to deal with a problem. But in the end, it doesn't really do that. It just sort of removes it, right, from public discourse.
Right. So what has been, to you, the most surprising about the last 5 years and the commemoration? And I guess, let's make this twofold question. What has been surprising, and what controversies have emerged that you didn't expect to see when this process started back in 2011?
I think I definitely would go back to the degree to which many communities throughout the South have started to remove those flags. That to me is a process that had already started playing out even before 2011, but just the pace at which it seems to be proceeding is really what is surprising me the most. In terms of the most positive development of the sesquicentennial, on the one hand, and I go back and forth on this. I'm kind of happy to see the extent to which we are now able to talk about some of the tougher questions of Civil War memory, specifically the issues of emancipation and slavery. But I'm kind of also surprised by the place of the Black Union soldier in our memory. It's almost the USCT has almost become the face of the sesquicentennial. And on the one hand, I think that shows some progress in terms of the kinds of stories we're now telling, in terms of what kids are learning in the classroom. Certainly that's a function of that as well. But I also worry in the sense that we almost have a narrow, naive view of Black soldiers. David Blight's Race and Reunion, this idea of that by the turn of the 20th century, we had, as a nation, pushed aside slavery and emancipation in our memory of the war. That has, I think to a certain extent, the sesquicentennial has been about trying to get right with that, right? That we have a responsibility to sort of correct that mistake, whether it happened or not. In fact, there's quite a bit of scholarship that has challenged that thesis. But the point I'm trying to make here is that the USCT has almost become the moral narrative of our war. And as a historian, that bothers me, that concerns me, because certainly there's a much more complex story to tell, one that historians have been telling, but one that I don't think has quite filtered into the public narrative of the war. The Civil War is, with the USCT at its center, almost anticipates the future rather than tries to figure out what took place between 61 and 65. That we now have, that the war is about anticipating what more has to be done on the civil rights front. The National Park Service's sesquicentennial is called From Civil War to Civil Rights. And so they're trying to see the big picture. And the Black soldier has been sort of instrumental in that. But again, to sort of sum it up, we're all Black soldiers fighting for freedom. We're all, in other words, is that why all of them enlisted? Were all of them brave on the battlefield? In other words,
in commemorating a type, you lose their individual motivation, you lose and everything else. Right, exactly.
And part of that, of course, is the lack of sources in getting at some of their stories, no doubt. But we've used their story, we've used their place in the war for our own purposes, and that's what we do, right? I mean, when we commemorate the past, so there's a certain inevitability to it, I guess.
Right. What do you think, sort of pushing forward from here? Not to get into this pushing, what you just warned against. The Reconstruction does not have the same sort of really clear events like Appomattox and like the assassination of Lincoln, right? There are certainly some important events that happen, right? But what do you see sort of in the next 10 years as we push through to the end of Reconstruction, the formal end and informal ends of Reconstruction? How do you see commemoration happening either sort of in communities in the South, where sort of some of the more horrific things happened, but also sort of on a national level where, is there going to be any sort of useful conversation about or reappraisal of the role that Reconstruction played in this country, and how it's taught and discussed and everything else? So your work is not done simply because we're 150 years past.
No, you're right. You're right. And I hate to be skeptical. I hate to just be doom and gloom here, but I don't see much happening. I do think I perhaps can see uh, the 14th and 15th Amendments getting some attention. Part of the problem is the events themselves are obscure. The other problem is, where do you visit? If you want to actually connect with Reconstruction, the way in which you can travel to Gettysburg or Antietam or a host of other sites related to the war, where do you go to remember Reconstruction? The National Park Service, as far as I know, I don't believe there are any sites geared specifically to Reconstruction. So that's a problem. I think the other problem is, obviously, we are still, for people who still think about Reconstruction, who have a stake in Reconstruction, many of them perhaps are still wedded to a kind of Gone with the Wind interpretation, a lost cause interpretation.
Well, many of the events are literally happening are in the South, right? And so, yeah, I mean, there aren't very many northern sites of Reconstruction.
That's right. It doesn't get as much attention in the, in the schools and the high schools. So, I'm hoping that at least the larger, institutions, the historical societies, the museums, are going to, do something for it, and I suspect they will. But I think beyond that, it's unfortunate, but I don't see much happening. And look, there are plenty of myths that we still tell ourselves about the Civil War. There are many more about Reconstruction,
right?
And it'd be nice to unravel some of it, but I don't. I wish I could be more positive. I just don't see that happening. Certainly in the classrooms, there is the opportunity now, more than a few decades ago, to bring to bear, a whole host of primary sources into the classroom. And certainly the textbooks give it much more attention than just a few decades ago. But in terms of a public memory of it, that one's going to be a challenge for Americans, because that one, you don't have, at least in the case of the war itself, for a lot of people who want to focus on the soldiers, the battles, you can do that and still focus a bit on the broader issues of race and slavery. Reconstruction almost just puts you smack dab face to face in the problem of race. And I don't know how you feel about it, but I don't think we live in a country that goes out of its way to talk about race in a civil way. It's again, go ahead.
Well, what was interesting to me, and this has obvious implications for how we think about Reconstruction, but although it's also problematic. A few years ago, it seemed as if there was a concerted effort on the part of some people to have the sort of reformation on Grant that we have had on Lincoln all the time around. But that reformation has sort of turned out to be just as messy as Grant is, right? Just as messy of a figure as he was, and just as messy in some ways as Reconstruction is, right? And so the effort that kind of felt like, let's start by rehabilitating Grant, make him Grant the Great, and so we then turn Grant the Great and make him a central figure in Reconstruction, and this will sort of open the door to a bigger and more positive national conversation about Reconstruction. Does not seem to have worked out in the way that sort of had been hoped.
No, I think that's right. Certainly there's been a reassessment of Grant in the scholarship, but I don't see any of that translating into a broader change in memory of Grant. I think he is going to be saddled with the charges of drunkenness forever, and also corruption. And that's unfortunate, because of course his presidency was important, at least in terms of understanding Reconstruction. But that's going to be it for Grant. Yeah.
Well, Kevin, this has been a fantastic conversation, and thank you so much for joining us today.
We'll have to get together for the bicentennial.
We will. It's only 50 years. Foreign Entanglements viewers, it's just a bit down the road. So
that's right.
Who knows what a podcast will look like in 50 years? We'll probably be beaming into people's living rooms. So.
Sounds great.
All right. Well, thanks for joining me.
Thanks, Robert. Take care.
And thank you, Foreign Entanglements viewers.